The Pacific, summer of 1944. The world's largest ocean had become the world's greatest battlefield, a silent blue stage stretching from horizon to horizon, waiting for the next page of history to be written in fire. The stakes were not simply territorial, they were existential. At Saipan, American Marines dug into volcanic rock, fighting inch by inch to secure a foothold close enough to strike the Japanese homeland. If the U.S. Navy failed here, if the Japanese fleet broke through, the Marines on Saipan would be cut off, and America's dream of ending the war without a bloody invasion of Japan would collapse. To the north, carrier decks shimmered in the morning heat. Men wiped sweat from their brows, checked ammunition belts, tightened flight harnesses. Pilots of the U.S. Navy boys not long removed from high school gyms and factory halls prepared to step into a sky where only steel and skill determined life or death. They were led by seasoned warriors. Admiral Raymond Spruance, quiet but brilliant, focused not on glory but on victory. Admiral Mark Mitcher, a leader whose pilots trusted him with their lives, and scattered among the flight decks, men like Alexander Vraciu and David McCampbell, names destined to be etched into aviation legend. Across the sea, Japan committed the last heartbeat of its once dominant naval air power. Months of desperate training. Reserve pilots pulled from half-empty flight schools. Carrier decks crowded with aircraft meant to avenge Midway, Guadalcanal, and Truk. The Imperial Navy believed it was ready, believed that the sky, once their kingdom, could be reclaimed in a single decisive blow. They dreamed of a strike so powerful it would shatter the American fleet, sink its carriers, and send surviving ships fleeing back to Pearl Harbor. They believed victory would save their empire. But belief alone cannot change fate, not when one side has radar, radios, combat-proven doctrine, and pilots hardened by years of brutal fighting, and the other has hope, desperation, and dwindling fuel. The waters around the Marianas seemed peaceful that morning, quiet swells, sunlight dancing over waves, seabirds wheeling lazily above. Yet beneath that calm lay tension like coiled steel. American operators studied radar screens, watching faint flickers on phosphor glass grow larger, multiply. Officers leaned over plotting boards, course lines formed, bearings updated. The enemy was coming, a massive aerial swarm, roaring across the ocean like a storm of engine noise and rising dust. Reports crackled over radios. Flight leaders adjusted helmets, checked oxygen flow, exchanged last nods. Meanwhile, aboard Japanese carriers Taihō, Shōkaku, and Zuikaku, flight crews rushed, shouted, prayed. Deck officers waved flags, pilots revved engines, white headbands tied tight, believing they were flying to glory or death, maybe both. Some strapped on samurai swords, symbols of a warrior past they hoped to honor. They did not know the true odds. They did not know American fighters would meet them long before they reached the fleet. They did not know they were flying into history's most one-sided massacre. This story is worth hearing because it was not just a battle, it was a turning point, a moment when the sky itself chose a victor in the Pacific War. It shows what training, technology, and discipline can achieve when everything hangs in the balance. It honors men who faced fear at 20,000 feet with nothing but faith in their machines and each other. And it reveals the tragic reality of a once mighty air arm meeting its final horizon. Brave pilots lost not because they lacked courage, but because the world had changed faster than their empire could adapt. Most of all, this day reminds us that victory is never guaranteed. It is earned through preparation, sacrifice, and the quiet resolve of ordinary men called to do extraordinary things. Their story is not just about aircraft and tactics. It is about young pilots chasing enemy shadows across sun-blazed skies, about crackling radios and tense carrier bridges, about radar screens glowing like ghostly warnings, about courage in the cockpit and tragedy on the sea, about a moment when the fate of nations flew on metal wings. This is the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the spring of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a fever pitch. Island by island, mile by bloody mile, American forces had clawed across the ocean, cutting through Japan's outer defense line and drawing ever closer to the homeland. For Japan, this was no longer about expansion, it was survival. For America, it was momentum, destiny, and the determination to finish what began at Pearl Harbor. Saipan, the key. An island fortress in the Marianas. If captured, it would place B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo itself. Every Japanese commander understood the consequences. Lose Saipan, and the war would shift, irreversibly in America's favor. That is why, as U.S. Marines battered their way inland, Japan gambled everything to destroy the American fleet, supporting them. They mobilized the remnants of their once glorious carrier Aviation, the same arm that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor and swept across Asia. But years of war had drained Japan's elite aviators. Veterans lay at the bottom of the ocean. Their successors, young, eager, but untested, filled cockpits once reserved for legends. Across the ocean horizon, Task Force 58 America's mighty carrier strike force sailed like a floating continent of power. 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, dozens of warships and carriers bristling with Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers. Radar ship masts rose like steel spires. Anti-aircraft guns glinted in the morning sun. The sea itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy. On flight decks, pilots lounged near aircraft, masks dangling around necks, joking with comrades to mask the tension. Some smoked cigarettes, others scribbled quick notes home, letters that might never be mailed. They were confident, even eager, but no one underestimated the enemy. Commander David McCampbell, tall and calm, stood like a pillar of quiet steel. Soon he would become the Navy's top ace, but on this morning he was just a leader, making sure every pilot under him was ready for the fight ahead. Nearby, Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu ran a hand over the sleek fuselage of his F6F Hellcat, the plane that would soon carry him into legend. These men weren't thinking about history. They were thinking about surviving the day. Below decks, mechanics wiped grease from palms, double-checked ammo belts, tightened engine bolts until knuckles turned white. The roar of aircraft engines echoed like distant thunder. Bomb elevators clanked. Radio operators hunched over headphones, listening to static, waiting for whispers of danger carried on invisible waves. And then, the first hint. Radar screens flickered. Operators leaned forward. A new pattern appeared, faint at first, then growing, spreading across the phosphor surface like an oncoming storm. Large enemy raid inbound. The words rolled through steel corridors and across carrier decks like a drumbeat. Alarm klaxons sounded. Pilots bolted upright. Deck crews sprinted. To the west, Japan's strike force was already airborne. Waves of A6M Zero fighters, Judy and Jill dive bombers, and torpedo planes droned eastward, heading into the dawn with resolve and hope. Above their carriers, flight controllers prayed silently. Those carriers, Taihō, Shōkaku, Zuikaku, represented the clawed remnants of Japan's naval air soul. But to Japanese admirals, this day was a chance for redemption, a chance to turn the tide, reclaim respect, and shock the Americans as they once did in 1941. The ocean between both forces shimmered deceptively calm, a wide, glittering mirror hiding destiny. Below it, high humidity hung in the air, distorting the horizon. Heat shimmered from carrier decks. The smell of oil, salt, sweat, and tension filled the air. On American ships, silence stretched for moments that felt like eternity. Then orders came like lightning. Launch fighters. Deck crews sprang into synchronized violence, spinning props, chalked wheels yanked away, wings unfolding like predatory wings awakening. Hellcats surged down decks, tailhooks bouncing, then burst into the sky with raw power engines roaring, exhaust trails carving arcs through humid air. There was no triumph in these takeoffs, only focus. Below, Marines on Saipan stared upward at the distant roar and wondered what storm was coming. Above, the pilots tightened harnesses, adjusted goggles, checked ammunition switches. The Pacific sky held a heavy stillness before the clash, like nature itself paused to witness history's turning gear grind forward. Meanwhile, in Japanese cockpits, some pilots whispered childhood prayers, hands shaking slightly. Others felt pride swelling. They believed they were following the path of samurai men born to die for their emperor. Yet doubt hung like a shadow. Many had barely fired guns in real combat. Training fuel was scarce. Hours in the sky had been rationed like precious metal. They were flying toward a machine forged by industry, doctrine, and brutal experience, and they did not know it. The distance between forces shrank. Radar operators spoke in clipped tones. Flight directors pointed toward blips on the screen. Squadron leaders formed up tight, disciplined, ready. Vraciu's voice, calm over radio. McCampbell steady as a stone in his cockpit. The sea far below rippled lazily, indifferent to the carnage about to unfold above it. In that moment before the first tracers lit the air, before Zero engines screamed in desperation and Hellcat guns roared in reply, the Pacific held its breath. Destiny approached on wings. Skill prepared to meet sacrifice. A nation's hope flew into the rising sun, and another nation's will powered upward to meet it. This was not simply planes and pilots, it was two visions of war colliding. Old doctrine versus new, experience versus desperation, technology versus tradition. And as the first silhouettes appeared on the horizon, as American pilots pushed throttles forward and dropped into attack formation, the sky ceased to be a canvas and became a battlefield. The stage was set. The hunters and the hunted were moments from knowing which they would become. The calm before the storm had ended, the Marianas were about to erupt. The first enemy dots appeared like insects against the glaring Pacific sky, tiny shapes expanding into wings, engines, and men diving toward destiny. American pilots tightened grips on throttles. Every heartbeat pulsed through metal frames and oxygen masks. Then came the call from a calm voice crackling over radio, Lieutenant. Commander Jim Flatley, observing the swarm. Asterisk, asterisk, boys, this is it. Asterisk, asterisk, and the sky exploded. Hellcats pounced from above, sunlight flashing off wings as they rolled into attack dives. Machine guns thundered bright streaks cutting through blue. The first Zero burst apart midair, its smoke trail curling like a ghost's final breath. Then another, then dozens. What Japan intended as a crushing first strike instead became chaos formations shattered before they could even reach attack range. Alexander Vraciu spotted 9 dive bombers crossing his nose, low and fast, desperate to slip through. "I've got them," he muttered, not bravado, but certainty. He fell in behind them, letting instinct and training fuse into one. Short, controlled bursts times tat, 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 asterisk. One plane flamed, then another. A third spiraled into the sea. Vraciu did not waste ammunition. Every squeeze meant a life, and seconds mattered. Asterisk, asterisk. 8 minutes. 6 kills. Only 360 rounds fired. Asterisk, asterisk. By the time smoke drifted from his gun barrels, he had become a myth in real time. Elsewhere, David McCampbell and his wingman faced a wave of enemy fighters. McCampbell's voice stayed cool as steel, even as dozens approached. Asterisk, asterisk. Just pick them off. Asterisk, asterisk, he advised. And they did, cutting through attackers with surgical fury. Zero pilots tried to climb, dive, scatter, but the Hellcat was unforgiving, its armor turning enemy fire to sparks while its guns shredded wings and engines like paper. Dive bombers pressed on through the slaughter terrified, determined. One Japanese pilot broke formation, plunging toward the fleet, refusing to fail his mission. Tracers stitched across his fuselage. Flames licked wings. Still he dove a burning comet. At the last second, anti-aircraft fire erupted from American ships, turning the bomber into fragments before it could strike steel. Shockwaves rolled across decks. Sailors shielded eyes as debris rained down into the sea. More waves came and met the same fate. American radar guided fighters straight into enemy squadrons long before they neared the fleet. Combat air patrols worked in layers, cutting through attackers like saw blades through wood. Below, Navy gunners scanned the sky with fingers ready on triggers, though many never fired a shot, so few Japanese aircraft broke through. In the distance, smoke plumes marked where some did desperate torpedo planes skimming waves, engines screaming low. Ships turned hard, wakes slicing white arcs into blue water. Torpedoes hissed into sea, trails fading, none found their mark. Battleships roared in reply, hurling walls of fire skyward. The air looked alive, tracer sparks, flak bursts, aircraft twisting like wounded birds. Japanese radio calls turned frantic. Pilots pleaded for help, gasped prayers, shouted warnings. Formation leaders barked commands that no longer mattered. They were being hunted. Asterisk. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, could not climb fast enough, dive steep enough, or withstand American gunfire. And then came the moment the Japanese command feared most. A scout plane, battered and trembling, managed to radio back across miles of ocean. Asterisk, asterisk, many enemy fighters, too many, our forces destroyed. Asterisk, asterisk, silence followed. On Japanese carrier bridges, officers stared forward, stunned, silent, pale. Their last great hope, the rebuilt air arm of the empire, was dying before their eyes, and they could not reach it. Back in the sky, one lone enemy bomber, riddled with holes, refused to surrender. It limped toward the fleet, smoking, trailing oil like a dying serpent. Hellcats circled, ready to finish it. But the pilot kept flying, wings shaking. He pushed forward until his engine sputtered a final gasp and the aircraft fell, silently, gracefully, into the waves. A warrior defeated but unbroken in spirit. By afternoon, the horizon glittered with floating wreckage and parachutes drifting like sorrowful white. Petals. American wings returned home low and empty, fuel drained, ammo gone, victory etched on faces both exhausted and stunned. Deck crews counted returning aircraft. Some planes landed shot to pieces, holes torn through wings, oil streaking fuselages. Pilots climbed out, drenched in sweat, hands trembling. But they were alive. 2 carriers, pride of the Imperial Navy, swallowed by the Pacific. As dusk settled on the water, the sea grew eerily quiet, broken only by the distant hiss of burning fuel and the whisper of ocean wind across steel ships. America had not just won a battle, it had shattered Japan's sky forever. This was the day the rising sun fell from the heavens. When the guns finally went silent and the last aircraft vanished into the vast Pacific haze, a strange, almost sacred stillness settled over the fleet. The skies that only hours before had been alive with fire, smoke, and screaming engines now stretched calm and endless, as if the ocean itself were trying to understand what had happened. Pilots stumbled across carrier decks, some smiling, others too drained to speak. Mechanics rushed to damaged aircraft, hands flying, touching holes gouged by desperate enemy bullets. Flight deck crews counted planes, and then counted again, unable to believe how many had returned. One sailor would later say, in disbelief, ****, I kept waiting to wake up. You don't fight a storm like that and come out nearly untouched. ***, the numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Japan had hurled everything. It had hundreds of planes, years of rebuilding effort, the last reserves of its trained airmen, and in return lost nearly all of it. Over 300 aircraft destroyed, many more lost, trying to return to carriers that would not be there to meet them. Pilots who limped home in shattered fighters found only burning decks or empty ocean. Taihō and Shōkaku, icons of Japan's naval pride, slipped beneath the surface, taking hundreds of men into the last hopes of Japanese carrier aviation with them. On those ships, the scenes were starkly different from the quiet triumph aboard American carriers. Men scrambled for rafts as flames tore across flight decks. Officers shouted, orders drowned by explosions. Below decks, trapped crew felt steel heat and buckle as seawater surged. Some recited prayers, others clung to memories of home families they would never see again. And over it all hung the bitter knowledge. Not only had the battle been lost, but the dream of a Japanese victory in the Pacific had died with them. Aboard U.S. ships, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood silent, expression unreadable. He had not fought this day for glory, only to protect the Marines on Saipan and secure the path to Japan. And he had succeeded beyond any planner's imagination. Admiral Mark Mitcher, calm and steady, watched returning aircraft with pride carved deep into his face. These were his boys, and they had done the impossible. David. McCampbell walked across the flight deck later, still in his flight suit, quiet as ever. He was not yet thinking of medals or fame. He was thinking of the men who did not return, though they were few, thinking of the responsibility of command and the thin line between triumph and loss at 20,000 feet. Alexander Vraciu, sweaty and tired, wiped oil from his goggles. 6 enemy planes in 8 minutes, a feat that would echo through aviation history, but he wore the same thoughtful look. Victory never felt simple. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the weight of what had been done and what it meant. Wider consequences followed swiftly. Within days, American aircraft spotted the remnants of Japan's once mighty fleet fleeing west, crippled and broken. The Imperial Navy was no longer a threat, not truly. From that day forward, Japan's carriers would never again launch a meaningful strike. Their decks would sail, but empty. Symbols of a power that had vanished into the waves. The ocean no longer belonged to 2 nations, it belonged to one. For Japan, this was not just a battlefield defeat, it was the shattering of an identity. For years, their pilots had been the terror of the Pacific, their aircraft unmatched, their spirit unbroken. Now, the empire stared at an unbearable truth. Courage alone could not stop the industrial force and tactical evolution of the United States. A young Japanese pilot who survived later wrote, "Heart heavy, we flew as warriors, they fought as a machine, and machines do not tire." For America, victory carried both triumph and resolve. The path to the Marianas was clear. Soon, B-29 bombers would rise from Saipan and Tinian, rumbling toward Tokyo. The skies over Japan, once the symbol of imperial might, would soon rain fire and steel. The war was not over, but the future had shifted. The ending had begun. Yet beyond strategy and history books, something more human lingered. Sailors leaned against railings. That night, staring across dark water at stars reflected like shattered diamonds. Some laughed softly. Others cried quietly, where no one could see. They knew what they had witnessed. They knew they had been part of a day the world would never forget. And somewhere far across the sea, families in Japan waited for sons who would never return, never march home, never tell their stories. A generation of aviators, bold, devoted, doomed by time and technology, had vanished in a single day. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was over. And in its wake, the Pacific felt larger, quieter, and forever changed. When we look back on that blazing June sky torn by tracer fire, filled with roaring engines and falling steel, it becomes clear that the Battle of the Philippine Sea was never just about aircraft or tactics. It was about the human spirit when history demands everything. It was about young men climbing into cockpits knowing they might never return, pressing throttles forward, not for glory, but because duty called and others depended on them. It was about leadership grounded not in speeches, but in preparation, discipline, and trust. The American pilots who rose that morning brought more than superior machines, they brought resolve. They brought the weight of every Marine fighting on Saipan, every sailor standing on a deck below, every family wading across thousands of miles of ocean. They understood what the stakes meant. They knew that if they faltered, men on the beaches would pay with their lives. And so they fought not recklessly, not blindly, but with skill sharpened by long hours, training built on sacrifice, and a belief in each other. And the Japanese aviators? They too climbed into their aircraft with courage. They flew with the same warrior spirit that had carried their nation through triumph and tragedy. But courage alone could not overcome the tide of time. Their empire had stretched too far. Their training could not match the years of attrition. Their tactics, once unmatched, now faced pilots who had learned, adapted, evolved. They fought bravely, and they fell bravely. History honors that too. What this day teaches us is that victory does not favor those who simply wish for it. It belongs to those who prepare relentlessly, who invest in people and ideas long before the storm arrives. It belongs to those who endure setbacks, learn from them, and rise stronger. It reminds us that bravery is not only in the moment of battle, it is in the long road that leads there, in the practice no one sees. In the hours spent learning, refining, enduring doubt and fatigue, legacy is not built in the instant the world watches. It is built in silence, over years, through discipline and faith in a cause greater than oneself. And sacrifice on both sides should not be forgotten. Japanese and American airmen shared the same sky, faced the same fear, and met fate with hearts steady and unflinching. Their lives, their courage, shaped the world to come. We honor them not by glorifying war, but by remembering the cost and the character revealed in its fire. So, as we stand on the far shore of history and look back, we ask ourselves, when challenge rises before us, whether in battle, in life, or in struggle, will we prepare? Will we stand firm? And will we meet the moment with the same resolve? Because in the end, the sky remembers, the ocean remembers, and so must we. When the cannons quieted and the ocean swallowed the last burning carrier, the truth stood unmistakable. The skies of the Pacific now belong to America. Japan's once fearsome naval air arm lay shattered, its finest carriers gone, its pilots lost to the waves, its dreams of halting the U.S. advance extinguished in a single thunderous day. Saipan would fall, B-29 seconds would soon roar toward Tokyo, and the path to Japan and ultimately to war's end opened wide. Yet behind those sweeping outcomes were men tired, oil-stained, breath still shaking from adrenaline, who had stared death in the face at 20,000 feet and returned not just victorious, but transformed. Some landed to cheers, others to quiet, empty seats beside them. Both sides had shown courage, both sides had sacrificed. But only one side's future soared onward from that day. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot did not merely tilt the balance of the Pacific, it broke it. It announced to the world that the era of Japanese carrier supremacy was truly over, and a new chapter of the war had begun, unstoppable and irreversible. For in one day, the rising sun fell and never rose again.